Hello, welcome to the Ellie Spitzer podcast. I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by the head of OFSTED, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector for Education, Amanda Spielman. Amanda Spielman, thank you for agreeing to join us and to give up from your valuable time. I thought I'll start by asking you a little bit about what's on everyone's mind, and which is the global pandemic, which we're in the middle of.
Of course.
Quite early on, I think, looking back, in the summer term, Ofsted has announced that they will be suspending routine inspections for understandable reasons. I think at the time the schools were closed at the time and only starting to bring back children. And that is still the case for now. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that routine inspections are scheduled to return next term in the new year, although I don't know if that's still on the cards, given that this is sort of a rolling situation. Are they expected to return next term?
So, as you probably know, through this autumn, in the summer we weren't inspecting at all. Through the autumn, we're doing what we've described as interim visits, which are small visits for the space of a day, and they're to help the leaders of schools talk through, explain what they're facing, talk through the things that have been challenges, how they're approaching it, and helps. It's really partly intended to help leaders themselves talk through, think through, stand back a bit from what's been a really hectic few months for most of them, and a very stressful few months. And obviously, it's also intended to give a level of assurance to parents and to government that everything that should be in hand in the school is in hand. And it's also feeding into a research strand. What we're doing is drawing together the evidence from these visits to do a series of reports, which are obviously for government, but which we're publishing more widely in the hope that they'll be useful for school leaders and others to really give them a sense of what's going well, what the tough bits are, what government others need to put a bit more effort into potentially. So it's very much conceived as something that's constructive and supportive in a very difficult time.
Now, when this was first announced, I think there was the usual outcry, which I think is, for my profession, quite routine. But I think, from what I hear, this has been going on for a couple of months now, almost, and I think the feedback has been quite positive from schools. I think schools have found these visits to be quite collaborative and non-judgmental. But you say you want to use them to reassure parents. Does that mean that you'll be publishing reports on individual inspections, or is it just a letter to parents? How?
And there are two things rolled up there. The first is, you're right, the feedback from the receiving end has been overwhelmingly positive. And people have used words like cathartic, which is interesting. And I think a lot of people have been starved of outside human interaction. I think there's no question that sitting down with somebody who understands what you're going through and really wants to listen to you talk about it is a valuable experience of itself for many people. Yes, we are publishing a letter that just summarises the conversation from the visits. It's not a judgmental letter. It's not an inspection report in the usual sense. It's just helping pull together the things that were talked about. It gives parents some insight into what's at the top of schools' minds at the moment. It's a very light process. And as you said a few minutes ago, the default expectation is that we'll be reverting to inspection after Christmas. But of course, we're in a world where in 3 months so much can change. I think if there's one thing that we've all really learnt since February, March time, it's that we simply can't plan a long way ahead at the moment. Yeah. I'm really pleased actually with how flexible and intelligent and responsive Ofsted's been to finding ways of working that fit the challenges. Yeah. We actually had an immense amount of our staff out helping the emergency effort in all sorts of ways through the spring and summer when we weren't inspecting. So I've tried to put a lot of my brain space over the last few months into how can we, with the capacity and capabilities that we've got, really help all the people and places that need help in a tough time.
The one thing, just finally on COVID, over the weekend, the government has announced a Queen's Honours List, and which was postponed. I think the Queen's Birthday Honours, which usually is published in the summer, in June, I think. And for me, it was quite encouraging to see so many educators being recognised as part of the, I think there was a stronger emphasis on people who were working on the front line, from NHS workers to food delivery drivers, and of course educators who were very much part of the fight against COVID. And I was also very pleased to see Rabbi David Meyer from Pages, from the Partnership of Jewish Schools, who received an OBE. And
wasn't that good to see? I noticed that myself and pointed it out to my colleagues. I was really pleased to see that. Congratulations. Congratulations to him.
No, I thought that was very, I think it's encouraging, obviously, to him and to his team and to what they represent and what they've done for Jewish education as a whole. So,
and in this context, I noticed also to the head of a Haredi special school in Gateshead, I was also pleased to see.
That's right, the Haskell School.
Yes,
which,
the Haskell School.
Again, was very encouraging. So, now if we can move on to talk about the relationship and sex education guidance, which I think I'm correct in saying has already come into force from September, but there is a bit of latitude, providing schools have done the groundwork and various elements of the consultation. I think some schools will have rolled this out already at the beginning of this academic year, and I think they have until the summer term, because of COVID, of course, to sort of take their time a little bit more. Now, can I ask you, and then there's also, I want to touch on the requirements around talking about same-sex relationships and the LGBT community, both as part of the Equalities Act in general, but more specifically for independent schools, as part of, I think, 2 of the standards in the independent school standards, which mandate schools to teach their children about the protected characteristics. Now, sort of an abstract question, where do you think the line should be drawn when it comes to the right of parents to bring up their children in the manner in which they choose to do so, in accordance with their religious beliefs, with their cultural requirements, and where is it the role for the state to impose something against the wishes of parents? Now, obviously teaching children to harm others or compromising their safety or their well-being is of course off limits, but where do you think the line should be?
Well, I think you're getting absolutely fundamentally to the concept of the nation state here, because what I think we can all see is that over the last several hundred years, in most countries, certainly in pretty much all Western countries, the concept of what the state is has firstly changed dramatically, and it's changed in the direction of a bigger state. So that what you might have seen a few hundred years ago, where the concept of the state was probably around sort of guaranteeing certain basic freedoms, administering justice, and defending the realm, but beyond that, intruding remarkably little into the lives of citizens, has morphed steadily over several hundred years to a sort of bigger and bigger conception. So there are many things in everybody's expectation of a state now, and I think COVID has shown that up in spades, that reflect a gigantic shift to sort of default expectation of government providing everything from utilities, health services, education,
of course,
everything under the sun, and it's a big shift. But I think it's one that we see all around the world, and at the same time, there is live discussion. There is live discussion, as there should be, and it depends a lot on people's values, individually or collectively, whether they like this conception of the state or whether they argue for something fundamentally different. But I think it's important to acknowledge that shift has happened, and that the institutions of modern states tend to be organised in line with that conception. So the thing that comes across to me so loudly and clearly in so much of what I see coming from the Haredi community is an argument for a fundamentally different conception of the state, of a much more limited state that looks to a different era of a very minimalist state that doesn't fit with the conception that's embodied in in many layers of law and institutions as they stand. That's how it seems to me. But I'm interested.
Yeah, but I mean, what is the answer? What do we say to a Haredi parent who may not be fully across the ideology or the philosophy behind the role of the state, but they very much live a sheltered life, and that's very much part of Orthodox, strictly Orthodox Judaism. They keep themselves to various degrees. They try not to engage culturally, certainly not at certain levels with the outside world. They don't think they're breaking the law. They don't think, and they know that they don't encourage hatred for anyone. They're genuinely peaceful and respectful, but they really don't want their child to be spoken to about various issues. How do we say, or how do we explain to them, or is it just the case, you live in 21st century Britain, that's the deal, take it or leave it?
Well, we do some. If you look at the way the British state, like so many other states, is now configured, the concept of sort of minimum expectations, minimum guarantees for citizens of all ages, is pretty strong, and education is one of the places where over time, not just minimum expectations in terms of literacy, but minimum expectations in terms of other things have been layered in. And schools are one of those sort of critical places that pretty much everybody goes through. Very, very few children are home educated through their entire education. So whenever governments feel under pressure or have concluded that they want to provide these guarantees, schools are one of the first levers that are looked to translate policy into practice that actually reaches children. And we don't have anything sort of built into the constitutional model or structures here that creates sort of group level opt-outs from that. That concept is simply unknown. So what may have existed informally for many generations in the context of very small groups, the larger a group gets, the more likely it is to be difficult in practice to accommodate very large, so very significant opt-outs from the model in place, unless there is some sort of pretty fundamental sort of constitutional and legal reform that enables that. So I think how I hear it, as I often hear it, it feels to me like an argument for some quite significant constitutional and legal reform, that where there is a very interesting debate to be had and legitimate arguments for many positions, but that takes me to something that as Chief Inspector I simply don't have the power to be part of, that would put me in a political policy space that is the wrong place for the Inspectorate to be.
Now, but I do want to get into a little bit more of the detail of what I think parents in the Haredi community are actually asking for, regardless of how it's articulated, sometimes clumsily. But what I feel as a Haredi parent myself, is as someone who's got children in the Haredi community, grew up in the Haredi community, and what I think can be done actually, what I think, not from a legal point of view, I'm not a legal expert, but where I think things could be done slightly differently. So I think we have to start with a little bit of background. I'm sure you have often wondered, you've read reports of independent Haredi schools where the facilities are really poor. There are real concerns with basics, health and safety, and resources are extremely limited. And yet you have parents who pay good money to actually send their children to these schools. They pay school fees where they could send their child just down the road to a state-of-the-art, beautiful state-funded school. Now you've got to ask yourself, why do you think parents do that? Why would they send their child? I don't know of any parent who wants to send their child to a substandard facility where there are wires exposed or the fire exits aren't clearly marked. But I know that the reason parents do this is because they feel that they can only send their children to a school that caters for their religious and cultural requirements. And they're willing to compromise on issues such as resources, facilities. Obviously they don't want it, but that's a compromise, a sacrifice they're prepared to make in return for an education that conforms to their views. Now, what I'm getting to is that the very existence of independent Haredi schools, they only exist to serve the wishes and the needs of their parents. If they can't do that, there's no real point for them to exist anymore. Now, the fact is that Haredi parents are not willing to accept either sex education. I am generalizing, obviously, but by and large, that is the case. Sex education, which includes, as far as they're concerned, all mention of sexual relationships, and that's why that covers LGBT relationships as well. But I've always strongly maintained that they don't want to talk about homosexual relationships because they don't talk about heterosexual relationships. I think that it took a long time, I think, and I'm not even sure if we are at the point now where, first of all, there's recognition of that basic fact on the ground. And the reason why that's so important is because what we're doing is the state, the Department of Education, with their enforcement action, is going after schools for something which is essentially beyond their control. What is the point of penalising schools, pressurising schools on those issues which, where there is a unanimous view from parents, we don't want you to do it. You don't have a mandate to do it.
I think you're coming back round to this same point. It's a desire for a group opt-out from the law, isn't it? I'm partly from education law as it relates to state schools, and partly from the independent school standards. And for me, I found the new guidance helpful in that in some respects it places some limits. One of the things that I'm pretty sure I've said publicly is that it's not always helpful to have sort of minimum expectations but no maximum expectation that can help parents understand what the most their child should be exposed to at any given age is, and give them the chance to point out if their child is getting more than they think they expect is reasonable at that point. But circling back, we have got not just law about education provision, but we've also got this Equality Act and the predecessor bits of legislation, which are some of the most tightly drafted bits of legislation around, and very clear legislative application to schools. So it is simply so I absolutely do see and recognise the depths of discomfort around this, and yet at the same time there is literally nothing more that I can do to be flexible. I do not have the discretion to say because otherwise this is something really good. Therefore, I can instruct inspectors not to notice this. The discretion is simply not there. So I'm sorry. I know I keep coming back round to this, but it's a fundamental change in the expectation, in the minimum expectation for schools that you're in different contexts coming back round to. And it's for me it's a deeply intractable problem. I wish it weren't.
But I think we all wish it weren't. But
yes.
But I think that point is the real sticking point. Is there actually a recognition that the hands of leaders of Haredi schools are actually tied in this? Because I think it's often been the assumption that schools are complicit in this. Now, of course, some of the language and rhetoric from some school leaders on the ground to inspectors has sometimes been confrontational and also very supportive of this ethos, because school leaders happen to be members of the community as well. But it is absolutely the case that school leaders in Haredi schools simply don't. If I was, as a head teacher, if I was to decide tomorrow to do an assembly on LGBT lifestyles or to do an assembly on sex education, one of two things will happen. Either parents stop sending their children to school, or I'm given my sandwiches and a roadmap. There's simply no two ways about it. So now I spent the last 8 years in total in headship, but 5 years at my current school, absolutely determined to do the best to improve the school and hope for the best that eventually it will be recognised. And I'm glad to say that it was. But can you imagine how difficult it would be for a Haredi school to recruit senior leaders or recruit head teachers when they know that there is this issue which is likely to seriously affect the school's judgment, at least in some areas, could affect leadership and management. And I know we might talk about small adjustments that were made recently. And this has been going on this predates your time as Chief Inspector. I think the earliest, these contentions first, sort of 2013, I think, when they started coming up in various, with the introduction of the British values guidance and in various different elements, until I think the guidance was sort of clarified, until it was whittled down to those 2 or 3 handful of issues. But I think ultimately, what are schools to do? I understand the authorities are saying, the department is saying, this is the law. This is beyond my pay grade. We've got an Equalities Commission, we've got statutory guidance, we've got statutory instruments, which means that there's nothing we can do. The problem school leaders have is that there's nothing they can do. Parents don't really care if the school has followed every single jot and tittle of the independent school standards. They know you're not doing it. We're not putting up with this, we shall not put. Some of them will go more extreme and say, well, I'll homeschool my children, which is still my right to do legally. So we are going around in circles. This is effectively what is happening. And I think it undermines opportunities for real school improvement. And I think there has to be a way to break out of this.
It is genuinely hard to see. I mean, I take a step back. I think about myself as a citizen in a democracy. And one of the things I'm very conscious of is I don't agree with every law that sits on the statute book. But I feel I just have to accept the ones I don't like. And there is only so much of my life that I can put into being part of campaigns for changing the law. And as it happens, while I do this job, I confine myself to this job and evidence that comes from it. I'm not going to get into discussing anything that isn't directly relevant. But yeah. I mean, as I see it, we really are at the level of a very deep disagreement about a conception of what the state is and the extent to which there should be opt-outs on right. grounds of religion or indeed anything else. Because one of the things I hear is that we are seen as secularist, and it's fascinating for me because we put so much effort into trying to balance these things, these different things that the law requires us to do, and the hideous language of protected characteristics. None of us likes it. It's
no.
sort of awful legalese. But there is no, for us, as they are given to us in law, there is no hierarchy. We cannot put one above the other. We must make sure that all are given the respect and seriousness they deserve. And what we see is that interest groups of various kinds, including faith groups, tend to be very strongly concerned with one of those, and very little concerned with the others. So in the eyes of each lobby group, we do not nearly enough to satisfy them that we are taking equality seriously.
Right.
So we are beaten up on all sides.
No,
and seen as protectors of the others and not
right.
of them, when we're actually sort of trying to do justice across the board. But there's not nearly enough discussion actually about the extent to which it's ever possible to reconcile some of these. They're set up in a way that assumes that all of these things can be fully protected without any trade-off for any others, and that's not the reality. In practice, they are absolutely bound to bump up against each other to a greater or lesser extent, and that's what we just have to carry on talking about, acknowledging, right. and finding ways of working with.
Can I just get the and I totally understand that position, and to be honest, I knew that before we had this conversation, because I do understand how it works, but it is still the case for leaders of Haredi schools, and I'm one of them, who feel like, Chief Inspector, your beef is with parents. Why don't you take it up with them? Why don't you go into one of the synagogues and have it out with them, and let us just get on and do what we can do? As soon as they agree, we'll agree. But at the moment, there's nothing we can do. But
that's a very interesting angle on it. That's I've not heard anybody express it like that before. That's
no, and that is very much how school leaders, people at the coalface feel. You know, there are various interests and people representing the community at a community-wide level, and they will come up with strong ideological reasons behind it. But for school leaders, it's often the case that we don't have a dog in this fight. This is about, we want to improve the school. I want to be able to recruit senior leaders who can support my work in the school, and without having to explain to people that, which thankfully I no longer have to do, but I had to for years, we're actually a good school in many areas, having to unpick a litany of reports and trying to sell it, which make it very, very difficult. I hope, and I know we're not going to solve this now, but I think someone needs to recognise that we've been going round in circle for a good number of years now. And I think a few years back, when you first started out and even beforehand, there were a longer list of issues that needed to be resolved. And I think they have been narrowed down. But I think we've narrowed it down to the last 2 or 3 issues around sex education, around LGBT teaching, which is really, we've hit a brick wall and we're not really going anywhere. There's one thing that I think I should just inform you of, which, and I don't know how you'll respond to this, but Haredi schools go as far as censoring their own religious texts when it comes to any sexual matters. Leviticus 18, where homosexuality is referred to as an abomination, is censored out in Haredi schools. And the law at the moment, you are legitimately allowed to teach children your religious position on homosexuality and say homosexuality is a grave sin on the pain of death, as long as you follow up and say, but according to the law of the land, they're allowed to. And you can see how that would not necessarily be equal when the school has got a faith character and when eternal law is always put higher than common law. Now, schools can do that legitimately and be graded outstanding. You can teach children that gay people should be killed according to biblical position and follow it up with an assembly so that, of course, we have to respect them. And yet we've got a network of schools who refuse to do either. They will not go anywhere near any sexual topics whatsoever. And this is part of the Charedi position of zero sexualization of children. Some people struggle to believe that it exists. Some people think, well, it's impossible. 15, 16-year-olds don't know anything about sex. But when you operate in a sheltered, closed community, where the internet is filtered, where you attend your own schools, where the boys and girls are educated separately, that is a reality. That exists. And I don't think this is the place to argue about the merit of it, other than just recognizing that that's their position. And parents really that feel very strongly, this is not about homosexual relationships. I've got the same problem with heterosexual relationships. And like I said, and you can have your team look into this, but their own biblical Talmudic texts will be censored if it makes any sexual reference whatsoever. And that's how far parents would go to maintain that policy of zero sexualization of children, which is actually more cultural than religious in a sense. But that's how determined they are. This is not a case of just saying, well, who are you to set law for us? We've got our own laws, because they will go as far as tampering with religious texts to maintain that position. I just wonder if, I just want to impress on you how strongly they feel about this and how far they're willing to go.
The strength of feeling is genuinely sort of very well understood. I think that's you must understand that this is not a comfortable or easy thing for us either. We have no desire to inflict pain or unhappiness on any Haredi parent anywhere. And as you said, I think you mentioned about your conversations with the Department of Education. A lot of this comes about with a framework put in place by wider government, over which genuinely individuals like me or even the Secretary of State for Education cannot simply reinvent off their own bat, even if they want to. And you were just talking about perhaps the apparent oddity of being able to explain one thing in religious education lessons and another thing in the PSHE lesson following. I think that perhaps people don't necessarily know about. So I'll explain for the benefit of your listeners that there's a curious accommodation was made between church and state back in 1870 when the state education system was formed out of the provision that existed at the time, and the government assumed responsibility for funding what had previously been church-run private schools, with specific provisions for the church, with the state taking on responsibility for the buildings as well. And the quid pro quo was that the church could carry on providing religious education in the tenets of that faith and daily collective worship for all children in that faith. Pretty much every other country in the world, in creating its education system, national education system at some point in the 19th century, went a different way and said there must be absolute separation between religion and state education. No faith schools in the state sector, no teaching of religious education. We created this typically British sort of hybrid model, which in the first instance was only about teaching religious education, because at that point the concept of education, of school education, hadn't broadened the way it's been broadened over the last 30 or 40 years. And then all these other strands get layered on top. So you're absolutely right that there are some accumulated anomalies, you might say, in what it ends up with, that you can look at it and say, how on earth did we end up here? And it's a long and convoluted story how we ended up here, and while at the same time having this incredible degree of freedom for people who home educate. With, we are more permissive than almost any other country. Because by default, this has been this is a very permissive country that allows people a lot of individual freedom. And perhaps one of the things we're picking up on in this is that Britain provides for a great deal of individual freedom, but the freedoms that you're talking about haredi parents wanting in the context of schools are more about sort of collective freedoms at faith group level, and that's not something that necessarily fits into the constitutional structure at the moment. So you're opening up and airing some really interesting points, and it's hard to know quite what to say on something, except that so much time here has gone over the last few years into really thinking about this and trying to make sure that we do not create any tripwires, and that we are as honest and open about what we have to do and how we go about it, as well informed and as careful as we can possibly be not to gold plate anything. One of the things I had the team here do very early on in my tenure was to go through with a fine tooth comb to look for anywhere where we could possibly be gold plating equalities legislation and going further than we needed to. And we found a couple of small things to tidy up, which we did. But because it's very important for me that we don't become the policy maker, that we don't start imposing our idea of what good looks like in this contested space. That's just not our job. We have to report against the standards that are set for us.
Okay, I want to move on and talk about something which is, I think, probably the most important topic in the context of haredi schools. The OFSTED annual report, published in January of this year, found that only 39% of independent Jewish schools are judged to be good or better. And that's compared to 76% of independent Christian schools and 61% of independent Muslim schools. It also found that Jewish independent schools are 4 times more likely to be judged inadequate compared to their Muslim and Christian counterparts. What do you think is going on?
I can't do very much in the way of comparative analysis here. We're talking about relatively small numbers of schools in each case, and we're talking about quite an unhomogeneous set of schools. It's and they're typically schools providing for very specific communities with very particular wants and desires out of education. The thing I can say is that across all of those, we've looked quite carefully to say, are there particular things that we're doing that is making it hard for schools to do well? And one of the things I know is that when we dig into it, we see that the schools that we don't report favourably on, it tends to be failings across the board. It's not about specifically about things back in.
I should point out that I did a bit of my own research and analysis. I can say the overwhelming majority of those 61% of independent Jewish schools who get a judgment of less than good have failings in the areas of quality of education as well.
And of course, we're not inspecting the religious education. That would be something that we certainly should not be going anywhere near. So we're looking at what for some schools is quite a small piece of their conception of their of what they're there to offer. But of course, the expectations about what all children need to be able to do in terms of basic literacy and maths, quite apart from what sits on top of that, are quite significant. So perhaps we see some schools simply not allowing enough time and space for that. In the state sector, in primary schools, those account for a very large proportion of the available time, probably at least half of the available time in most primary schools, for example. So some of it may reflect simply prioritisation, but beyond that, it's clear that I think our reports make clear that there is some really disappointing stuff going on, where perhaps curriculum just isn't thought through, perhaps the curriculum isn't fit for purpose, where teaching, the quality of teachers just isn't there, people aren't sufficiently trained or experienced. There are many schools where looking at it really carefully, thoroughly, it's just not yet where it should be for children. And I know that's a huge concern for you, and rightly so.
Yes.
Rightly so, because at the end of the day, it's unfair to children.
It most certainly is, and again, I've done a little bit of analysis, and there's a total of around about 10,000 Charedi children in independent Jewish schools, and there's probably around, this is not accurate, but around 6,000 of these children who are in schools that are judged to be inadequate or requires improvement, less than good, and that has been the case for a number of years now. Now, I don't want to talk about what happened when many of these schools were judged to be good or outstanding, but I don't think that there's been a sudden decline in the standards in those schools. I think there was a different approach from the authorities in general. There was sort of a hands-off approach to religious independent schools. There was maybe too much trust, but there was a sort of thing, do your thing. And then perhaps it was the Trojan horse saga in Birmingham, whatever it was that triggered more intense scrutiny of faith schools, I think, in general. And I think it suddenly brought to light some systemic failures across a network of schools. Now, the real question is, I know that your role as Chief Inspector, and the clue is in the name, is to inspect and report, and it is up to the department to take action where they see fit. But I think your role goes a little bit beyond that. I think you've said publicly before that you work firmly and unapologetically in the interest of children, and it's about raising standards for children. I think it's certainly in Ofsted's mission statement, but it may even be in the logo.
Raising standards, improving lives.
Raising standards and improving lives. And we're not raising standards for these schools at the moment. Can I put a proposition to you? And I think, as someone who's been doing this for a number of years, I think the current framework, inspection frameworks, are designed to be used as an instrument to measure the success, the progress of a school, or to measure the performance of a school that falls short of that bar. What it is not designed to do is to go into a network of schools that are so far behind that bar. In fact, they have never been there. They've never been at that standard, not from the day they were founded, and constantly try and measure their progress against something which at the moment, or at least in the beginning of that journey, is too far away. What tends to happen is that an inspector goes into a school and sees an absolute shower and sees, in some cases, really, really poor. And they report on it, and then 6 months later or a year later, there's another inspection. Different inspectors will come in because that is the policy, not to have the same, certainly not the same lead inspector go into the same school twice. So it's very difficult for an inspector to come in which has only got the same instrument to use, the same framework, and to recognise any progress. Because even if there has been progress, it can't be measured yet because it will take much longer. Because if you've had children who are 3 years behind the national standard in literacy and are now only 1.5 years behind, that's still not good enough. That child still struggles to read, still not age appropriate, but the school has made a significant amount of progress. So I think, and I know this is very ambitious, especially when in the context of, is it 25,000 schools that Ofsted has under its remit, to suggest that we take 60 or 70 schools and draw up some special remedial framework. But if I'm honest, I think that's what we need. I think there needs to be an instrument that Ofsted can use to measure progress for schools, which I don't think when you took this role you were expecting to deal with schools that are at this level. But the fact is, if you read the reports, very few of the schools manage to break out and manage to actually meet standards. They are constantly just going around into a cycle of failure to the point of leaders being encouraged and incentivized to try and simulate what a good school looks like instead of actually putting in the work.
I'm so familiar with that. And we published a report last year that is, it's not quite directly in this territory, but on schools I think that had been requires improvement for a decade or more. And out of that, some thoughts on the kind of sort of enhanced visit. I think we're talking about enhanced diagnostic visits, and what with COVID and one thing and another, those haven't come into being. But what you're talking about is very much what we used to do in the state sector in the context of schools that got an inadequate judgment. When academisation came in, I think that the concept was that the policy instrument ceased to be the sort of Ofsted monitoring and follow-up visits to inadequate schools, and became the academisation order and bringing in an academy chain to do to help do the things that needed to happen. I'm not sure that we've ever had that in quite the same way in the independent school space, where I think it wasn't seen as a sort of government responsibility to sort them out. It was down to the proprietors, given that message to sort out. But your concept I think is very much in a space that Ofsted has operated in the past, and actually your thoughts, perhaps not in the context of this podcast, but your thoughts on what the ladder is like for haredi schools in this position, and actually I suspect that a lot of those ingredients would be very similar for some of the other small independent faith schools out there.
Yeah. Possibly. Although, look, I agree. I think, from my own experience, I believe there's a very clear formula. Yeah. And you're right. It's not. It's for another time to discuss that. But I know because I've tried and failed until I got it right. And I still think that some very specific requirements from schools to do very specific things, and a degree of recognition for those who do it, even if they're taken off. You're not given a grade for now. We'll bring you back in when you're up to it. But I think that will put schools on a journey, on a pathway to improvement and to ultimately being able to re-enter the wider. And it was
before my time that the academisation policy came in. So I'm not going to get it exactly right. But I think schools that were put into special measures then had a sort of termly monitoring visit that was looking at progress in that way, and was following up quite specifically on the failures that were identified in the initial inspection, and having the discussions around whether the steps that had been identified were being taken, whether they'd succeeded, what lumps and bumps had been found in the past.
No, but do you see the point I make about
Entirely.
The difference of a school 3 years behind national standards and then has managed to close the gap by a year or a year and a half? It's still nowhere near the point of being able to get recognition for it. And of course you could argue school leaders are there, they should act only in the interest of children. Who cares about what the inspectors say? But we all know that there is incentives and deterrence involved in what inspectors say in reports, regardless. I know the reports is maybe technically to the Secretary of State and to parents, but the fact is that we know that it's a big factor in what motivates the leadership of a school. And that's an important tool, which at the moment isn't really working. And I think we really need an instrument that works. I don't think that instrument exists at the moment. The concept of that progress monitoring after an adverse judgment is something that's absolutely been part of our core toolbox in the past. Because of the academisation alternative, it's not at the moment, but it's a very familiar thing, and certainly I'd be very happy to hear a bit more about the things you think of. Because I don't know anyone feels very strongly against it, but I think allowing the same inspector, not necessarily for full standard inspections, but for progress monitoring inspections, unless there's been a specific request from a school about some tension, but providing there's a constructive relationship or something like that could make an enormous difference, because an inspector can then turn around to you, to the line managers and say, this school is on a journey. I think that school is, if it continues on this track, and then Ofsted can get an idea, because we have at the moment the 60% of failing Haredi schools. There's a spectrum there. There are plenty of those schools who have actually got real potential and can really go some. And then, like anywhere else, there's some real poor and bad leadership as well. At the moment, I don't think we have the instruments to sort them out. And I think and to recognise who is actually doing the right thing and who isn't. So and I'll personally be very happy to share my own expertise and to offer advice, but I think it's needed. Someone with local knowledge, someone who's actually done it, and someone who's understood that. So,
I mean, again, this is something that all the work we do in the independent sector, we do under commission from the Department for Education.
Yeah.
We can't unilaterally go out and invent a different kind of visit or start doing some extra work. So this very much would sit in a wider conversation. But I'd be really interested to understand your thought, your thinking about what it is that, as you say, gets a school from being miles adrift to being in the normal range and sort of homing in on doing really well for children. It's a very important strand.
Just finally, before we wrap up, I know I've taken a lot of your time, but I know many of the viewers of this particular podcast will be members of the Charedi community, and many of them parents of Charedi children. Is there any message that you have for parents in the Charedi community? It's
a very simple message. I know that you want the very best for your children. We want the very best for your children. It's a rocky path. I know finding a model that works for everybody in the concept of this state that doesn't necessarily work as you would wish it to. But please be assured, we want the very best for your children exactly as you do, and we will always aim to work constructively with your community.
Amanda Spielman, thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Ellie. Thank you.
Thank you.